Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
Hi, and I'm Graham.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling, and where we believe that everyone can be a storyteller. Today in the Prime Material, Prehistoric Storytelling. In the Wilds, Giant Apes. And in the Tavern, what would you do if you ran out of food? Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Graham. It's happy to have you along.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Yes, I'm so excited to be able to chat about Paleomythic and prehistoric storytelling and all the things related to that. If you just want to introduce yourself to the audience, tell them about Paleomythic and plug that and talk about yourself, just tell everybody who you are.
Okay, yeah, I'm Graham Rose, and I'm the author of Paleomythic, which is a stone and sorcery RPG, and by that I mean it's a RPG set in the prehistoric times, but it's also very much a mythic RPG, and with elements of fantasy. Myself, I've been designing RPGs for many years. Haven't published anything much previously, really just for my own amusement and enjoyment. But yeah, so I've been role-playing since the 80s, which might give you an idea of my age. But yeah, and tinkering with games since then. I started tinkering with D&D back in the 80s and haven't stopped tinkering.
That's awesome. Well, we certainly love that here. Well, I guess before we get into the Prime Material itself, just to get a couple of announcements out of the way, remember to follow us on social media. You can find us at Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at PlotHooks on all those platforms. We do have a new patron to shout out, FN Science Man. Thank you very much for joining the Patreon. And for the rest of you, if you haven't checked that out, we would genuinely appreciate your support of the show and all of our written content that we do up there. We have, of course, our weekly Relics release, our bi-weekly Overheard release, which the next issue of that will actually come out today. Our storytelling support, all the benefits relating to the podcast itself, including live listening and early release accesses for the podcast. So all sorts of stuff that you can get up there on Patreon. Do check it out, and if it tickles your fancy, then we'd love to have you supporting the show. Final quick announcement, the DMs Guild. Our next release is coming out on the DMs Guild in just over a week from recording this podcast. Actually, it will already be out by the public release of this podcast on the 23rd of August, that Monday. Villangers will release. It's a 75-page document with 25 NPCs, which are completely detailed out for you with all of their public personas, their stat blocks, and all sorts of that. But of course, the shtick is these are people that are respected within their particular communities, but are secretly harboring a dark secret, thus the name of the supplement, Villangers. And that goes live in just a few days, the 23rd of August. So be sure to check that out on the DMs Guild whenever it goes live. A lot of hard work went into it. There's a big team. Our biggest team that we've ever had went into this. So we're excited for you all to check it out and enjoy it. But with all of those long-winded announcements out of the way, let's dive into the Prime Material. Prehistoric Storytelling. Now, how did you get into this Originally, like obviously you've been tinkering with TTRPGs for a long time. What drew you to this type of storytelling? What drew you to the prehistoric era as a place to tell stories in?
That's interesting. I think I've always been interested in the prehistoric in one sense or another. I think initially I was quite interested in a post-apocalypse setting, and the idea of humans regressing to a very much earlier state. And if I remember correctly, because we're talking many years ago, I started looking into what would actually happen to human beings if they sort of devolved rather than evolved. And I think what came from that was just a general interest in the early humans, early hominids, and then more broader an interest in the flora and fauna of what's effectively the Pleistocene epoch, which is where humankind sort of first, the advanced humans sort of first appear. But it's hard for me to pin down. But interestingly, I found recently one of my old notebooks, and this would have been from the 90s, where I'd actually written an entire prehistoric RPG in my notebook just by hand, including my own sketches of hominids. But yeah, so it's obviously been there for a very long time.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's certainly a fascinating era of history. Of course, the real world has existed for a very long time, and prehistoric is kind of a little bit of a nebulous term in the fact that, well, it has a specific definition. It's just kind of tossed around at the lay level, so to speak, meaning lots of different things. Generally, what it means, by my understanding, is just the time before written records. And usually, whenever we're talking about it in a TTRPG sense, we're referring to something usually kind of Stone Age adjacent, which is the era where the pinnacle of technologies that the most advanced humans used was primitive stone tools. And so that's typically what I think of whenever I think of the term prehistoric. We're talking about playing in a setting with Stone Age equivalent humans. Now, of course, you can play with the settings of that, so to speak, where you can, bring dinosaurs up, and so that the humans and the dinosaurs are running around. Or you could do what Paleomythic did and add a lot of that kind of the classic fantasy elements into it, and develop your own sort of flavor of prehistoric. But generally, we're talking about humans being at a point which is more or less Stone Age adjacent. Would that be kind of accurate for how you have treated it?
Very much so. I think essentially, and if you've got any sort of knowledge of sort of prehistory, I sort of stop at the point where classically a sort of Bronze or Copper Age that society begins. So, although that being said, one of the things I wanted to do with Paleomythic was very much make it as a toolkit, so that if you wanted to add Metal Ages, if you wanted a Bronze Age setting, it wouldn't be that difficult to do so. But yeah, my sort of remit was to have a system that focused on the sort of early humans, but very much people and not as the very early hominids who were effectively just apes. Simply because on thinking about it, I thought that's probably too difficult for most players to actually consider and conceive of. You've got to be a real prehistoric nerd to really think, well, actually, maybe I could play one of the early hominids, the Homo habilis or something. But I wanted to cover a good span of time within that Stone Age setting. So you can play something that is very close to a fantasy game, but effectively just lacks some of the technology. Mm-hmm. Or you can play something that is very much very early Stone Age, so that you are lacking a lot of Stone Age technology as well as the later, what we would usually use in fantasy technologies like metal swords and armor and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and as I read through the Paleomythic book, it just kind of really strikes me that as, you know, we're talking about storytelling in this space, it naturally lends itself, at least in my reading, to leaning in a lot more to the small scale. Not that you can't have big epic adventures within Paleomythic, because you absolutely can, but when you're talking about a prehistoric lifestyle, you're talking about something that is much smaller scale than especially modern life, but even, you know, talking about middle-aged life, which is what your typical TTRPGs would be set in. You know, you're talking about, you know, a small hunter-gatherer community that is very insular and relating with itself, and you know, your daily life seems to be a lot more focused on the small scale, on interpersonal relationships, than I think I often get whenever I play D&D and I'm teleporting from city to city and dealing with these epic problems and stuff like that. And it really creates kind of a unique storytelling feel.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. And I wanted to start from a point of view where it was fairly realistic, or certainly has the veneer of realism. In the and to do that for a prehistoric setting, you really do have to focus on the tribe or the small settlement, because in reality the tribes would have been small at that period of time. They would have had very limited knowledge of the rest of the world. Their world would have been quite what we would consider these days quite a small radius, geographical radius around where they actually live. Essentially, they would know what they could walk to within a few days or a few weeks at most. And that's the limit of their knowledge and understanding. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's it does offer a unique chance to really just explore what it would be like in that sort of closed environment. But you don't need to do that, of course. And I think there's plenty of opportunities in the prehistoric setting to with a little work, simulate any sort of adventure. So if you wanted to do a grand scale political machination thing involving different cultures and different tribes, it's certainly doable, but that's not where you would start.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I like that. I love that flexibility, you know, not just within Paleomythic, but just within the prehistoric storytelling genre in general, because for me, I like the interpersonal relationships that develop, the small scale things that develop whenever we're talking about role playing. You know, there is something to be said about loving to fight, you know, dragons and monsters and, you know, bringing down kings and all sorts of the typical video gamey type stuff that we enjoy when we're role playing. But just the small scale things. I love having, whether it's actual mechanics or just different things built into the setting, which actually promote that small scale type of interaction. And I just think that prehistoric storytelling does that in a way that really fascinates me.
Yeah, very much so. I think if you think about living in a small tribe where everyone knows everyone, what that means is, in terms of interaction, that anything that you do that has some sort of impact with another person has an impact throughout the tribe, and you can't escape it. So if you make a bad decision about the way you're interacting with someone, if you make an enemy, you can't easily get away from that enemy because they're part of your tribe. And obviously that can then be broadened, and you can work with other tribes close by and those sorts of things. But yeah, it does mean that there are those sorts of dynamics that as a GM you can develop, and as a player you can play with. That can become quite fascinating because you've got that real tight focus on individual tribes.
Sure. And as far as other aspects of just daily life in a prehistoric setting, it seems to me that we're also dealing with an environment that's a lot more dangerous than we typically deal with. When we're talking about something that is, more modern day, modern humans have certainly established ourselves as the dominant species in the world, as being atop the food chain, so to speak. But when we were talking about a prehistoric setting, while even if dinosaurs don't exist in your particular version of prehistory, if they have already gone extinct like they had whenever actual humans appeared, there's still various types of what are termed megafauna, larger creatures which are fairly dangerous, which we don't have to deal with in modern day.
Incredibly so. I mean, you have there's two aspects to that sort of conflict danger, and one is everything's generally a lot bigger. So you have direwolves actually existed then, and they were as the haunches of a direwolf would have come to the shoulders of your average person. You've got mammoths and saber-tooths and a whole host of similar big cats prowling at those times that were huge. I mean, a smilodon, a saber-tooth, could attack a mammoth. So if it can consider attacking a mammoth, what it could actually do to a lowly human, it will. But then the other aspect you've got there is that you haven't got the same technology to deal with those. So you're going against those. Using your flint tip spears, your fire hardened spears, and your antler picks, and those sorts of things. So it presents a considerable survival challenge. And then if you add to that the other non-violence hazards that you can encounter, the various dangers and the diseases and so on, and the smaller creatures that can poison you and so on. Yeah, it's a challenging environment, indeed.
Absolutely. But hey, we love challenging environments as GMs. That's what makes things fun.
That's what makes a game, isn't it?
Absolutely. Now, I love in Paleomythic how you really thought. Again, I'm kind of narrowing in on the small scale and how these things affect just individuals and not like large large factions or groups or whatever, because it does seem to lend itself to that sort of storytelling whenever you're talking about first getting started out. I love even in terms of like systems of measurements, and we're talking about things that are so prehistoric, even in terms of like your combat ranges, how, because there is no defined, they don't have a concept of what a foot is, of what a meter is, of what, that sort of thing. So you have for your ranges for different things, you use the 5 settings, I guess, of hand range, rock range, spear range, bow range, and sight range. And I think that's a fascinating thing, because we are even thinking about how simple things are defined within this prehistoric setting, because nothing is guaranteed to work exactly the same way, because they haven't had the time to refine complex systems and communicate with each other, with different tribes and different factions, to build up a unified system of just how things work that just doesn't exist.
Very much so. I think early on, one of the things I wanted to do with the system was have actual within the mechanics of the system. I wanted the prehistoric setting to be built in. So yeah, you're right. The things like the range. Well, if you're if you're talking to each other as members of the tribe, or with someone from another tribe, you are talking about things in terms of how far you can throw something or see something, and likewise with more broader with things like the way you define a character in terms of their traits. I wanted to move away from a system that used numerical values to something that was purely descriptive, because in that sort of setting, you're not talking about fine gradations. Someone is either strong or they're not strong, or they're weak, or they're agile or they're not agile, or they're clumsy. So it was that. Those are the sort of things that early on I decided I have to build in to the system, so that even when, as players and GM, that you're talking about mechanics in the game, there's that inclination to talk about them in those terms. So it's still evocative of the setting. Was generally where I was going with that. So
that's awesome. Now, in Paleomythic, the place that all these interactions happen is the continent of Mu, which is, of course, building off of the hypothetical lost continent, which it was in the Pacific, so to speak, in the distant past. Tell me a little bit about just this place where we get to play in Paleomythic.
Well, I very much wanted to have a mythical place, and of course there's no reason as a GM where you can't shift everything back to Earth, a sort of Pleistocene Earth if you wanted to, but I wanted to give people the opportunity to really create their own world, and I thought the way to do that was to use a fictional continent, somewhere that was absolutely removed from the rest of the Earth, so that you could do anything you want with it. So I broadly defined Mu as this catch-all continent where there's a place in the north where it's mountainous and cold, and there's a place in the east where it's steamy jungles, and there's a place in the south where it can get arid and desert-like, and a place in the west where it's dense forests and hills and so on. But I wanted to keep it all fairly broad, so that as a GM you didn't feel compelled to stick to the sort of canon ancient Mu, and you could actually still work with it without it being too rigid. But yeah, but ancient Mu. That my idea was that there would be this continent where you could have pretty much any sort of geographical feature, any sort of environment in it that you wanted. There's a suggestion of a history, and that I make reference to ancient ruins and ancient civilizations. There's a pantheon of gods, and there's some suggestion that some of them are primal, they've been there before time, and some of them that are newer and are supplanting some of the older gods. But again, I wanted to keep them fairly broad, and I didn't want to particularly suggest that they were in specific places or they had specific followers. Again, keeping with that idea that this is a toolkit, so I was very much wanting to give the GM the tools required for them to create their own world. So you've got ancient Mu is a land where there's anything and everything that you wanted. You could create the sort of darker Lovecraftian Robert E. Howard sort of darker, almost alien settings and old ruined cities if you were so inclined, or you could keep it very much realistic and have Ice Age settings and that sort of thing. It's very much a place to be tinkered with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you have a Facebook group as well, the Paleomythic Idea Exchange, which, people who play Paleomythic just kind of bounce ideas off of each other for lots of different things that could be included within, a prehistory setting and help each other tell stories.
Yeah, it's a good group, and that they're quite often they will post little tidbits of information they found on some prehistoric site they've seen, or some latest discovery, some archaeological discovery, all with the idea of just taking these, using them throwing them into your game, and I think those are the sort of little details that give you, again, it adds to that veneer of realism. It's for the sake of a throwaway sort of sentence, you can change the player's whole idea as to how realistic or fantastical something is. And it's those little ideas, I think, that are key to that sort of storytelling.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems to go even into, like, when we're talking about, being smaller scale, where if we've got a place that is largely focusing at first before you go out adventuring, so to speak. You're just within this tribe, this smaller tribe of people. In order to get that field, you need those little details, don't you? You otherwise it's easy just to imagine yourself walking around in medieval armor through this village, as opposed to walking around in prehistory.
Yeah, very much so, and I think it's again with the details of some of the mechanics. I wanted to make sure it was emphasised to players that they're not just in a generic fantasy setting. One of the things I introduced, which I know can maybe frustrate some players, is that how unreliable tools and weapons can be. But it's those little details that remind players and the GM that actually, this is prehistoric, and my flint spear can break, and I need to be careful with these things, and need to have the materials necessary to craft new items and repair things. So and it's that, I think, if you're looking for some, easy way to distinguish between the prehistoric setting and a later medieval setting or fantasy setting. I think that's probably the one thing you could choose, the fact that you can't just go to a village and buy something. You've got to collect the things to make it yourself, and you've got to look after it because it can break.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Adds a lot of extra intrigue too when you're out in the middle of nowhere.
It means it's those little details. Like you as a GM, your treasure isn't gold. It's you can put animal hides as the treasure, or blocks of flint, because those are what become valuable to characters, it adds that little sense of realism in what's still a fantasy game.
That makes sense. Yeah, I usually close out kind of the prime material when we're talking to somebody about a specific type of storytelling by asking, what's something that the person thinks is the most important thing when it's talking about telling stories in that particular space. And it seems like for you, those little details are kind of the most important thing to really get that feel, and to really make sure that those little things are there will really benefit in immersing you into a prehistoric environment.
I think that's right, and I think it's probably true of any setting or genre that if you add those details, whether they're details that you've conceived of yourself or whether they're details that are just real, that add a bit of realism, those are the things that players take away and remember. It's in the tavern, it's that the description of the meal you just had or the ale you just drank, which doesn't have to be these things don't have to be an extensive monologue, but a sentence which has that sort of little hook of realism or just something unique is what makes, I think, a whole role-playing session memorable.
That's great. That's awesome. Well, is there anything else that you want to share specifically about Paleomythic before we head over to the wilds and check out a giant ape?
Well, I would just encourage people to give it a go. I think they will find, even if I would say that even if you're not initially drawn to the idea of a prehistoric setting, I think the game offers a lot of good ideas about how you can run, say, for example, a fantasy game and consider things that you may not have considered before. Things like how do you make items? How do you survive when you've got nowhere to buy your food from? How do you forage? How do you hunt? What are you hunting? What's hunting you? And those are the sort of considerations you're forced to have in Paleomythic that maybe you don't normally consider in your fantasy game or whatever game it is you're running. So I would just say, give it a go. Also, for the if I say so myself, I think I've created a system that may be very different from what some players might be used to. As I say, I don't use any numbers. Characters are purely descriptive. You can create a character using a paragraph of information. Your character can be just a name and a description and some traits, which are essentially just some adjectives, and then what's effectively your occupation title. So your character could be described as someone who's agile, aware, strong, resilient, a little clumsy, and that's a cave painter with the ability to summon spirits by painting their pictures on a cave.
Yeah. Yeah, I really enjoy that character creation process too, where you're picking those traits and stuff. Do you want to delve into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the mechanics of the game are really quite simple, and it's a D6 game. So essentially, you're rolling dice to get a 6. You don't have to count the number of 6s. You don't have to add anything. There is no mathematics involved. You're simply rolling dice to see if you get a 6. And your traits govern how many dice you're rolling. So if you've got 5 traits, you're rolling 5 dice. So you could describe your character as, say, accurate, aware, brave, strong, wise. That's your 5 traits. So you get 5 dice for any sort of action you want to do. If you're attempting an action where you have one of those traits is applicable, say you're trying to solve a puzzle where you've got the trait wise, so that gives you a bonus die. So you'd be rolling 6 dice rather than your 5. And then tools give you a relevant tool gives you a bonus die, but tools can break, so you have to be careful about what you're using when, and likewise with weapons. Weapons can very easily break, so again you have to be careful. But characters are further described with a talent, and you can have 1 or more talents. And they're things like from the sort of quite realistic, sort of mundane, if you like, talents of things like a crafter or a storyteller, to things that are more esoteric, like an effigy maker who makes weird sort of doll creatures that can do various magical things. Or there's the quite macabre soul eater who can consume flesh, and in doing so robs the body of its trait or talent for for a short time. And that's your character. Your character is described purely in that descriptive term, and the mechanics as a whole all use that same basic system. So there are mechanics for crafting and dealing with exposure if you're in extreme weather, or dealing with starvation. They all fall back on that fundamental rolling dice equal to the number of traits mechanic.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love the simplicity and just I think very applicable to the setting itself, way that it all works. It's very awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, if any of you out there in the audience are interested in the Paleomythic book, it is out there for purchase. It's published by Osprey Games, and you can certainly go pick it up, and I encourage you to do so. And regardless, I encourage you to delve into some prehistoric storytelling. It certainly is an awesome kind of twist on this TTRPG space that we all know and love so much. But for now, I think that's about all the time we have in the prime material. Let's head to the wilds and look at a giant ape. Alright, we're out here in the wilds. Today's creature, the giant ape. And of course, this isn't just, oh, hey, look, it's an extra big primate. We're actually talking about, in the megafauna type term, the Gigantopithecus, an ancient large ape that went extinct about 300,000 years ago, probably somewhat related to modern day orangutans. Not too much as far as fossils related to this that have been discovered. It's usually a lot of teeth and mandibles, but we know that these existed in this Stone Age type of period, so yeah, they're in Paleomythic. Tell us a little bit about them.
They are. It's an incredible. I've always loved primates and apes, and they are an incredible creature. They're entirely vegetarian, but even so, if you actually met one today in the wild, it would be a terrifying experience. We're talking of something. If you can imagine a gorilla, and I've been lucky enough to actually see gorillas in the wild, and they are huge, big, imposing creatures. This is a gorilla turned up to the max. It is a gorilla on a scale of 10. It's anywhere between 9 and 12 feet tall. So when it stands up on its haunches, this thing could have been twice the height of a human.
Wow.
So so you imagine one of these crashing through the jungle heading towards you. And even though it's not going to want to eat you, it still could seriously end badly for you. And these things were just like as far as we know anyway, like a modern gorilla. These things are pure muscle. They're just huge. Even smaller primates. I've seen chimps in the wild as well, and when you look at them, you cannot see anything other than this like sinewy muscle, like a bodybuilder type muscle. So one of these things, if it took a swing at you, it would be very messy indeed.
I love the fact that they're vegetarians, and yeah. I find that aspect very intriguing when it comes to different creature encounters that we have in TTRPGs, because usually when we talk about a non-intelligent creature, and by that I mean one that doesn't talk, one that is just kind of you're going to come across it, and yeah. it is a not necessarily a monster, but it is a ferocious animal that you have to face and encounter. Typically we're talking about something that the players show up, they roll a few dice, and they kill the monster. Here we're talking about something that is not expressly dangerous to the party on its face, because it doesn't want to hunt them, it doesn't want to eat them, it is going to come across your party's path in a territorial way, or in some other way where the party has gotten on its nerve, or something has angered this particular creature, and it adds sort of almost like a role-playing aspect to the combat, because it's not that this creature wants to beat the party to smithereens. It's powerful enough to do so, but it's really only going to combat the party because the party did something which is problematic for it. And if the party could figure out what actually is going wrong, whether they've gone somewhere that they're not supposed to be, whether there's some young that a female is defending and attacking the party for that reason, whether they're destroying the food source of this particular creature, intersecting that into a combat encounter can make for a really interesting circumstance for your party to be in.
Very much so, and I think there's you can add another nuance to this as well, in that if you think about the humans we're talking about, they're their experience of other humans is limited. Even if they know their local tribes, they can conceive of other things beyond that. That would be other types of humans. So if they're encountering one of these, how they would interpret that and how a GM would describe it can determine how you would then react to it. So, for example, if the GM is saying you see this huge 12 feet tall, two person tall man, hairy man in front of you, what are you doing? And it gives it's that extra nuance of, are they going to interact with this thing as if it's a sentient human, or are they going to assume that it is actually an animal? So there's all that complication about how they interpret its actions, and then how the ape in turn interprets the actions of the player characters, and whether they assume that they're being threatening by trying to talk and so on. So yeah, as an encounter, it can be something other than a simple you see a creature and you attack them. It can be this whole complex interaction that could go anyway, and who knows how that will end.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in the Paleomythic terms, they are in terms of making sure that they come across successfully strong and huge. They have double resilient and double strength as far as their traits are concerned. Yeah. They can absolutely just massacre you if you enter into a fist fight with one of them.
Indeed, and that's one of the sort of mechanical things I've done in Paleo is that if you're wounded, you're effectively temporarily losing a trait, but when creatures have double traits, what that means is they can afford to lose one of those traits and still be counted as having that trait. So a double strong great ape means that it can lose one of its strong traits and it's still strong. So it's still getting all the bonuses it's going to get from being that strong creature. Yeah, so and those are the sort of in the same way as if you were going up against, say, a mammoth or a smilodon, a saber-tooth. You do that as a party. You don't do that as an individual unless you're extremely powerful and proficient and foolhardy, perhaps.
Yes, definitely, probably that. That's awesome. Yeah, certainly great creatures, and while I'm sure they were great, I'm glad I can't walk outside and encounter one of those nowadays, at least.
Yeah, I'm sure it'd be fascinating, but terrifying.
Yep, maybe if there was a fence in between us. That's like
a sturdy fence.
That's very true. One time when I was in Alaska, I was about maybe 20 feet from a female moose and her calf, and but there was a fence in between us. Otherwise that would have been a very dangerous scenario. But there was a nice fence in between us.
And I've never seen one, but they look huge.
Oh, they're enormous. They're enormous. Yeah. There's a reason that whenever people hit them in their cars, it's oftentimes fatal for the humans because they're so tall that whenever you hit them, you just take out their legs and their whole body just kind of rolls in through your windshield because you aren't hitting their body at all. You're just hitting their legs.
Yeah.
Anyways, ferocious wildlife still exists, just in different forms.
Indeed, yeah, very much so. There's still some hints of megafauna still left in the world, thankfully.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're beautiful creatures.
Indeed.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have in the wild segment. I guess let's head back to the tavern and close out the show by looking at a plot hook. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook to close out the show. What would you do if you ran out of food? Now, it's not often that we run across this trope in more mainstream TTRPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. Food is just kind of assumed because, even in a medieval setting, it's not often that you run out of food when we're talking about, a typical European fantasy type setting. And of course, when you're talking about a futuristic type setting, even less so. But I mean, goodness, Dungeons and Dragons has the create food and water spell, that clerics can get at a certain point. So running out of food is not something you generally have to encounter whenever you're talking about role playing. It's just something that you have. But when we're talking about a prehistoric setting and a hunter-gatherer society, food is one of the main driving sources of interactions, whether it's, interactions between tribes in terms of trade or interactions within a tribe in terms of actually providing food for one another or running out of food or what have you. And perhaps it is the dominant influence of day-to-day interactions is do we have enough food in this location? Do I have enough food to eat to accomplish my tasks? And so if you run out of food, that is a pretty impactful situation.
Indeed, very much so. The whole prehistoric survival theme, for want of a better description, is that idea of survival, and the major component of that is food. When you're traveling somewhere, if you're going to explore somewhere, if you're going on any sort of journey or mission or anything like that, so one of the considerations you have is, yes, you take some food with you, but you'll probably at some point run out, and then you don't have any other recourse other than to provide that food yourself. In Paleomythic, you've got a number of options. You can try and forage, you can try and hunt for it, or if you can find some civilization, another tribe, then you can try and trade for it. But other than that, you are driven to forage or hunt. In Paleomythic, you can forage, and your success depends on the season and the geography. So if you're in a forest, then it's likely that it's going to be more abundant for foraging than mountainous regions. But then, of course, if it's winter, it's really difficult to keep yourself going just by foraging. And there is a system in Paleomythic, which is still fairly simple, because I've tried to keep everything really simple, but that allows you to forage, and you can then determine what you've actually found if you're successful at foraging, and how many meals and so on. Or you can hunt, and the hunting will generally give you more meals worth of food, but it's also more difficult. As you can imagine, you're trying to stalk a creature and then kill a creature. So depending on what the characters are going for, would determine how easy or difficult it is, and and how many meals they're going to get at the end of it. So in Paleomythic, the creatures are broadly defined as small, medium, and large, and that if you're successful hunting a small creature, which is easier to do, but you will only get between 1 and 6 meals out of that creature. Where a larger creature will give you more meals, but it's harder. And then a very large creature will give you even more meals and some materials and things like that, so you can get some hide and bone that you can use. But you are also running the risk of getting injured doing it, because you're if they're big, they're usually dangerous.
Yeah. Hunting a giant ape is no easy feat.
Indeed. Let alone things like mastodons and mammoths and those sorts of things. So, but yeah. So, but that should be. I think it's appropriate for it to be a constant concern of the characters. It should, in the back of your mind is, have I got enough food? Have I got enough materials? What happens if my spear breaks? What am I going to do? Because that, and then those are the things. It's like, if I haven't got a spear, I can't hunt very well. So, and then of course I cover the results of what happens if you aren't successful at getting food, which is starvation, and that starts to impair your abilities and weaken you. And of course, I would hope that GMs don't ruthlessly slaughter parties by just having them kind of constantly starve. But it's one of those things that that I think, if used well, can add a real sort of tension to the game.
Yeah, and it creates really like a whole storyline in essence. If you're talking about a particular place that you're in where people have to perhaps they have to be nomadic based off of the seasons. Maybe they're in an area where it runs out of food in a particular time of year and they have to spend the winter in another camp location. If you have an area where blight has struck and all of the fauna is leaving because all of their particular vegetative food sources are dying, and so now you end up with a situation where your group has to leave because they are running out of food based off of environmental factors, and you start the whole adventure that way, where you're headed into the unknown because you're out of food, and it's brilliant to have such a simple thing impact an entire story.
That's a good observation, and I think you can use that as a starting point for and become as elaborate or not as you like. You can what's caused your lack of food? Is it just the environment, or is it the machinations of some evil tribe that's trying to get your food area or your foraging area? What's the reason behind there being no animals to hunt? Is that some sorcery, or just a change in the environment? And these are the sorts of things you can use and run with to create a bigger plot than just simply, I've got to go and find some food.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have this week on Plot Hooks, or excuse me, I think that's about all the time we have this time on Plot Hooks. Thank you very much for joining me, Graham. If you want to just shout out yourself once again, and anything else that you'd like to plug as we close out the show.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. And as I say, please do give Paleomythic a go. I think you may well find it a very refreshing change.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much for listening. Be sure to check out VILLAINGERS when it launches in just a few days, or depending on when you're listening to it, has already launched. Be sure to check out our Patreon, follow us on social media, and thanks from all of us here at the Plot Hooks team. I'm Samuel. We will see you all again next time on the Plot Hooks Podcast.